shadows in the dark. Don't trust what you cannot see. Touch your skin and call your name. It's just the past that looks back at me. Left your home just to get away, but you took the buses with you. Set things up just to break them down. Keeps your mind down, nothing new. There's new inspiration. Media actually does. Gone up savior. Government hunts them down. There's new inspiration. Media actually does. Gone up savior. Government hunts them down. Yeah. All that's left for you to see is a reflection of myself. All that I've been taken by someone else. Taken by someone else. Taken. Yeah. Watch out for TV, high on dope. My nights are Lucy reruns. Talk shows up the current hit. Sanction self-indulgent numb. Throw away what you got. Blame what's missing from your life. It's not your fault things worked out this way. It's someone's mother, daughter, wife. There's new inspiration. Media actually does. Gone home savior. Government hunts them down. There's new inspiration. Media actually does. Gone home savior. Government hunts them down. Yeah. All that's left for you to see is a reflection of myself. All that I've been taken by someone else. Taken by someone else. Taken. Yeah.
All right. Here we go. All right. Hi, I'm CheeseSlice, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well on this Thursday morning. We got a show today where we're going to be talking about Vietnam, going all the way back to the time where, at least from where before I was born. And we're going to talk about how the CIA probably had a lot to do with monkeying around with all that business. Anyway, let's go ahead and bring on Gloria and Jeremy. We're going to be recording an hour today for the radio. Gloria, how are you doing? Jeremy?
Good. Hey, Jayme. How you doing? Hey, Jeremy.
Yeah, we're on a tight clock today, so let's get the show on the road. I'm going to hand it over to you and let's do it.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Left on Left, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying. I'm Gloria Guillo, a former administrator in New York City government, an investigative journalist, vice chair at WBAI Radio, and a co-founder of Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement, a group so left it's right on. I'm joined here today by a resident expert, Jayme Kuzmarov. Jayme is a professor at Tulsa Community College, historian, investigative journalist, and managing editor of Covert Action Magazine, an online magazine that focuses on CIA and deep state activity. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Listeners should form their own opinions. Today's show is on the whitewashing of the war against Vietnam. Since April 30th, 1975 marks the 50th anniversary of when North Vietnam prevailed and Saigon fell. We will be discussing Jeremy's recent articles in Covert Action Magazine. The first one is titled, Did Legendary Filmmaker Ken Burns, whose documentary revealed harsh truths about the Civil War, intentionally hide harsh truths about the Vietnam War to whitewash the CIA. And CIA oversaw hideous tortures in Con Sun's tiger cages and other prison facilities in Vietnam, and others. Ken Burns' Vietnam War documentary has been called definitive, even healing. It was broadcast coast to coast on PBS, funded by corporate foundations, widely praised by media and academics. But for all its emotional interviews and dramatic footage, there's a deeper political truth it refuses to confront. At the center of what's left out is the role of the CIA. If you watched Burns' series, you saw images of pain and confusion, American soldiers doubting the mission, Vietnamese citizens caught in the middle, politicians overwhelmed by events. But you didn't see the machinery that drove the war. You didn't see the CIA's covert operations, the psychological warfare, the death squads, the lies. By the CIA's own estimates, over 20,000 people were neutralized. Neutralized means murdered. Some estimates go higher. This wasn't an accident. This was U.S. policy carried out behind the scenes, far from public debate. Burns also avoids the CIA's involvement in propping up the South Vietnamese regime, including its collaboration with drug traffickers in Laos and its support for corrupt warlords. He doesn't talk about how the CIA-backed PSYOPs manipulated American and Vietnamese opinions. Why does this matter? Because it's not just about the past. The CIA wasn't acting alone. It was doing the dirty work for U.S. corporations without accountability, without transparency, and often without democratic oversight. By scrubbing that history clean, Burns makes the war look like a tragic misunderstanding. He shifts the blame onto culture, class, and political miscalculation, when in fact, much of the violence was intentional, covert, and systematic. Burns frames the war as morally complex, but whitewashing the CIA's role is not complexity, it's omission. It protects institutions that should be exposed. And it's not just the CIA, it's the whole idea of American innocence. The series shows that we were divided, that everyone suffered, but when you blur the lines between the invaded and the invader, between the occupier and the resistance, you erase power. Vietnam was not a symmetrical war. It was a war of domination, and the CIA was one of its sharpest tools. Ken Burns says, there's no one truth in war, but if that means ignoring how the war is built, planned, and executed, if that means erasing the fingerprints of those who made it happen, then that's not truth. That's storytelling in service of the state. We don't need more comfort. We don't need more balance. We need clarity. The CIA helped destroy a country's dream of independence, and America called it freedom. Until we face that honestly and completely, history will keep repeating itself. Jeremy, please educate us on the real history of the Vietnam War. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gloria. I think that was an outstanding analysis. And I mean, the film, yeah, from the outset, it presents this kind of red peril narrative. And actually, I've seen there's a new series on Netflix about the Vietnam War that really does the same thing. And it fails to contextualize it amid a larger imperial history of the United States in Southeast Asia and drive for domination of the continent, going back to the U.S. colonization of the Philippines. And in fact, I have an article coming up that shows it goes back to the mid-19th century when the U.S., there were these commercial interests who saw value in Pacific Islands, and the U.S. started to take over those Pacific Islands in the 1850s, 1860s. And then you have the colonization of the Philippines. in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then you have World War II in the Pacific, which really was provoked by the United States because they didn't want Japan supplanting European colonial empires, and they wanted to dominate the region. And the U.S. acquired a huge number of military bases as a result of its victory over Japan. So, I mean, that would have been a better history to start the film. Instead he presents this kind of Red Scare, which we, the domino theory that we know was just an illusion of policymaker to kind of mask their imperial ambitions. So he could have really educated people about the imperialistic policy that the U.S. has pursued in Southeast Asia and how Vietnam fit in that larger pattern, and the racism toward the local population. But he didn't do that. He promoted these tropes that you were saying, about tragic misunderstanding and that kind of thing. And I think from the outset, he frames it like, oh, they were honorable men on all sides, and that's, as you point out, it's failing to hold people accountable. Well, they're honorable men, and in Germany when they invaded, engaged in naked aggression in Europe, where they were honorable people. In France, when they took Vietnam as their colony and treated the local population like slaves. What about Britain in the Rhodesias? Were they honorable men? I mean, it's that trajectory, and it's just an unwillingness to acknowledge that. That reality that the United States is an empire like other empires, and that its leaders are not acting based on good intentions, but based on imperialistic interests, and they have no regard. They wanted to use Vietnam for their own purposes. They had no regard for the aspirations of the people of that country who had been fighting against foreign aggressors for so long and had fought a heroic victory against the French. But they thought they would use Vietnam, and cultivate this regime in the South and use as a base for U.S. operations in Southeast Asia to counter the Chinese and to gain more of a foothold in the region and to build up Japan, its allies' economy. That was part of the purpose. They wanted to integrate South Vietnam with the Japanese economy and kind of build up a powerhouse to counter China and preserve the U.S. military empire in the Asia Pacific. There's nothing honorable about those intentions. It has no regard for the ambitions of the Vietnamese as a people, and will keep them subjugated and divided. And that was the goal of U.S. foreign policy. They didn't want a strong Vietnam under a nationalist communist leadership that would ally with China and counter U.S. attempt to dominate Southeast Asia. And as far as the CIA, the CIA played a very vital role in the way you described, including the Psy-War aspect, because there was a CIA-funded organization known as American Friends of Vietnam that was set up to promote propaganda to valorize the puppet regime of Ngo Dinh Diem that was installed in South Vietnam following the Geneva Convention, because the U.S. didn't want the U.S. leaders didn't want Ho Chi Minh and the communists taking over the entire country. They tried to manufacture this regime in the South. And I use the term puppet because it was financially dependent on the United States. And Diem had sat out, the leader in Ngo Dinh Diem was a Catholic, which was the minority in Vietnam, who persecuted the Buddhists, who were the majority. And he had sat out the French War. This was an epic battle in their history, equivalent to the American Revolution. And Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap led this epic victory against France, who had kept the Vietnamese people in slavery and exploited their resources and humiliated them for over half a century. And here is Ho Chi Minh to emerge as this great leader to lead his nation in defeat. A tiny third world country defeated the mighty French Empire, which was bankrolled by the United States. And his military lieutenant, Vo Nguyen Giap, used guerrilla warfare methods out of the Mao Zedong playbook. And they were national heroes, even greater than George Washington in our country. And imagine the arrogance of the United States taking this guy, this Catholic who had sat out the war years in a monastery in New Jersey. Imagine if during the American Revolutionary War, you had a guy sitting in Belgium or something in a monastery cultivating some support from European politicians. American would not, for 1 second, want this guy anywhere near the United States, let alone leading the U.S. in Washington. So the absolute arrogance. And now that there's an academic movement to present Diem as some kind of patriot, and he was not a puppet, he had his own agency, but they refuse. They do what Burns does. They don't look at the manipulation behind the scenes and all the funding that went into his government by the United States. The U.S. built up his army and financed his army and police force, who carried out these repressive campaigns to root out the supporters of the Viet Minh, who had led the liberation war against France. Goes in, Diem criminalized them, and he started torturing. He had torture chambers below the Saigon Zoo, and then he passed a law that allowed for secret military tribunals, and that's what led to the emergence of a guerrilla movement in the South to overthrow his government, backed by Ho Chi Minh in the North, and that's what led to the Vietnam War. And CIA was so instrumental. They set up American Friends of Vietnam to promote this propaganda, and Diem was portrayed like Zelensky is portrayed now, as some kind of hero, this great Democrat. He's going to bring democracy to Asia, and he's the Winston Churchill of Asia. That's what Lyndon Johnson called him. And they got articles in all these academic and influential, highbrow journals of that era. Although one was honest, they said democratic one-party rule. So he wasn't quite democratic. They were trying to spin it that somehow he was democratic, even though it was one-party rule. And meanwhile, the CIA was building his repressive instruments, and it was a horrid, torture campaign that was carried out, and it led to the infamous images of Buddhist monks immolating themselves to protest the barbarism that was going on and injustice of that regime, and that captured world attention. So how you spin this regime positively is amazing, but that's what liberal academia is doing now. The entire field of Vietnam War studies was taken over by a group that was intent on rehabilitating Diem's image and showing he's not an American puppet. And that goes exactly along with what Burns was doing in his film. And actually, the film advances CIA disinformation, because there is one CIA operative featured in the film. His name is Rufus Phillips, and I actually met him at a conference at Texas Tech University about 18 years ago, and now he's deceased. He was a top lieutenant of Edward Lansdale. He was a Yale graduate. He's right out of the novel The Quiet American. He believed in American virtues, but he worked with Edward Lansdale, who was infamous. He was a CIA agent who was sent to build up Diem's secret police force. And Lansdale also wrote a lot of Diem's speeches. He had been in the Philippines, and he cultivated a client leader named Ramon Magsaysay, and he led this counterinsurgency operation against the left-wing Huck movement in the Philippines. And then he was sent to Vietnam to replicate his magic, and his top deputy was Rufus Phillips. And he's featured in that film, the Burns film, and he says, Diem was a hero. I forget exactly the words. It's in my article, but he made it seem like Diem was this great leader. So it's continuing CIA disinformation. Diem was not a great leader, and that's why the U.S. itself turned against him and ultimately assassinated him, because they realized he was not a sustainable leader. He lacked legitimacy, and he had alienated the Buddhist population, was 95% of the population, and had completely misgoverned. So even the U.S. and CIA recognized that, and so they turned against him and backed a coup, and that brought more instability to South Vietnam. But the Burns film promotes CIA disinformation, with Rufus Phillips trying to rehabilitate the image of Diem in that film. And none of these programs are discussed including there were programs to draw Catholic refugees and other anti-communists from the North. It made it seem like there was a humanitarian crisis in North Vietnam because the communists took over. But in fact, the CIA was trying to sabotage the North's economy and isolate it. And then they offered incentives for people. They paid them to come south to build a base for Diem's government, and they offered them land, although they never often followed through. As usual, they deceived people. It was all for public relations and propaganda, and none of that is discussed. But that is actually well documented in the Pentagon Papers. You see, we know a lot about Vietnam thanks to, and the covert program have been known for a long time now, because in part Daniel Ellsberg was a man of conscience who decided he had to expose the corruption to the public, and he leaked the Pentagon Papers, and that disclosed a lot of details about what the CIA was doing that normally would have been secret. And they were forced to declassify some of their documents as a result of various lawsuits. So in fact, it's all in the public record, but Burns still leaves it out of his film, which is a complete whitewash. And it was financed by the Ford and Rockefeller foundations, which have deep ties with the CIA. So that's not surprising. And in fact, the Rockefeller Foundation, part of their mission is to undercut left-wing intellectual ideals. That's why they place such a heavy emphasis on funding intellectuals and even alternative media groups. The whole goal is to undercut left-wing ideas. Like a left-wing critique did emerge about the Vietnam War. You had some brilliant intellectuals associated with the anti-war movement like Noam Chomsky and Bruce Franklin, who wrote great books that people can read. Chomsky wrote 3 books on the Vietnam War: one, American Power and the New Mandarins, and For Reasons of State, and At War with Asia. And Bruce Franklin wrote a number of books, including Vietnam and Other American Fantasies, that present what we could characterize as a left-wing viewpoint, that the war was rooted in American imperialism, that it was racist, that the Diem government was a puppet regime. Those kind of ideas are presented in those books. So this film is designed to undercut those ideas by rehabilitating Diem, by disassociating the war from a larger imperialistic strategy in Southeast Asia, and doing what you were describing, making it seem like there are all these complexities, when really it's not. It's a case of naked aggression and war crimes carried out by the heir of the European colonial powers. But these films want to have the public think otherwise, and there are contemporary reasons for that, as you suggest, that the U.S. continues to be an empire, continues to wage imperialistic wars, and doesn't want a movement developing in opposition to that. So they have to spin the Vietnam War a certain way.
Thank you, Jeremy. Oops, I'm looking at something and it just left. There's another article that I didn't put into the opening monologue, but it really touched me. It was one that you wrote based on an interview with Brian Wilson. And I'd also like you to talk a little bit about that, because he goes into, what he had believed and how that was, the kind of the racist ideas, and how that was a big part of it, and how he rose above it and ultimately paid with almost his life, but other serious injuries. So I'd like you to talk about that a little bit. But just before that, I wanted to just comment that what you were describing about Diem's murder or assassination is a great cautionary tale, and I hope everyone listens to it who is a puppet of the United States, because it involves one of our favorite quotes, Jeremy, the one by Henry Kissinger. It may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal. And I'm hoping that Zelensky hears this, and also Al-Jilani and a few other people that feel very comfortable right now, but may not be so comfortable when their usefulness is no longer there.
Yeah, and I've made that argument about Israel, and that the Jewish people have made a terrible mistake in allowing Israel to be used as a kind of pit bull of U.S. empire in the Middle East. And now Israelis are hated around the world for the horrific deeds they've carried out, and how, because of U.S. support, it empowered the most hardline extremist elements of the Zionist movement. And Jews will face a backlash, and the long-term security of Israel's in question. They're being bombed now by the Houthi, and this is something Noam Chomsky warned about a long time ago. And they tried to claim he was a self-hating Jew, and in fact, he was actually an ardent Zionist in his youth. He was just horrified by what had become of Israel. That there was a lot of promise, that's just another example. But yeah, it's instructive to study history. I mean, I'm amazed. I met a bunch of Ukrainians. I gave a lecture, and they're so naive, and they don't know anything about U.S. history or U.S. foreign policy interventions. And I told them to study the record. They're being used, and they will suffer, and they have suffered. And look at the Vietnamese. The population was divided. I mean, empires don't have good intention. I think that's what the Vietnam War teaches us, and what many Americans are oblivious about. Even people in the anti-war movement, they think it's just a few misguided policymakers steered the ship wrongly. They don't realize that nation states are not moral agents. They reflect the class interests at the top of that society, and they operate often in a very brutal fashion. I think social movement can try and humanize the system if they're effective. But Vietnam showed, that they just used Diem and the South Vietnamese leadership for their own purposes, and when they lost their utility, they had no problem about selling them under the bus. And I was at a conference in Texas Tech a few weeks ago, and I was giving a paper there, and that conference attracts a lot of South Vietnamese from that community, and the ARVN generals who are still alive, soldiers who are still alive, and some of their family members. And they showed a documentary about the ARVN, that's the South Vietnamese Allied Forces and their army. And it was sad. He was saying that in his class of the military, there were 300 in his class, and only 10 survived the war. And then he said, well, and then we went back, then they migrated to the United States as refugees. And he was discussing how McNamara went, the defense secretary and key architect of the war, after the U.S. reestablished relations with Vietnam in '95, and they had some conferences. He went and he met with the North Vietnamese, but the guy said, but we were living down the street for him in Washington, and he never met with us. He didn't give I can't say it on the radio about us. He couldn't care less about us. And these had hard lives. I mean, they were considered kind of traitors in their own country. They either had to flee the country, they faced retribution after the communists took over. A lot of them migrated to the United States. They had a hard time starting a new life. And the American leader didn't care at all about them. They just used them. And when they weren't up to par, they just threw them to the wayside. And look at the Hmong in Laos. The U.S. tried to, when they were fighting the Pathet Lao in Laos was allied with the Viet Minh, and they were the strongest political force in the country, and they won elections that the CIA sabotaged. And this is something the Byrne film doesn't discuss at all, how the CIA manufactured a war in Laos because first they tried to finance the Laos military to fight the Pathet Lao, but the Laos military was totally corrupt and militarily ineffective. So then they started training a minority group, a tribal ethnic minority group, the Hmong, who had migrated from China several centuries before and had certain grievances. And they were actually split. Half the Hmong allied with the Pathet Lao, and the CIA recruited and trained the Li clan of the Hmong to fight the Pathet Lao. And William Colby bragged in the PBS TV history that preceded the Burns film that, oh, the Hmong were magnificent fighters. Yeah, Lansdale called them magnificent guerrillas. Colby said they were magnificent fighters. They fought the Pathet Lao for 10 whole years and extended the war for 10 whole years, but they were all decimated. They were used as just cannon fodder.
Jeremy, as a side note, can you talk about the I believe the assassination of Colby?
Okay, well, yeah. Let me finish my story about the
Sure, but
Hmong.
I just even CIA directors get
Yeah,
off.
okay, I'll mention that too. And to finish the story about the Hmong, they were used as cannon fodder, and it basically led to their extinction as a people. And then they had to flee Laos, and also some came to the United States and had a hard time integrating. So and they were using child soldiers by the end of the war. So their youth were being totally just sent to a meat grinder, totally slaughtered. Their way of life was destroyed, and they had to flee their homeland. So, and then the CIA, didn't care at all about them afterwards, and the Pathet Lao won anyway. So, and it's like in North America, they use native. They would, foment division between the Native American groups, use one group to fight other natives, and then they would send them to the reservation just the same. So that's how imperialism operates. Yeah, and they don't even care about their own people because, William Colby later, began speaking out against some atrocities that went on at the church committee hearing. So he was viewed as a traitor, and he was murdered himself because the reasons are unclear, but probably because some top people in the CIA felt he had betrayed the CIA's honor by revealing some secret before the church hearing, or he may have also had dossier on the CIA involvement with organized crime and drug trafficking, and he had stuff also on the Clintons that he was writing about in a newsletter that he had developed, and then he was murdered. He was found in the canoe. They claim that somehow he was eating a meal at 8 o'clock at night and just decided halfway
half
through
a sandwich
because the food was still on his table, half eaten, that he decided to go for a canoe ride, even though it was dark at night and he was in the middle of eating dinner. And everybody who knew Colby said he was a meticulous man. He planned everything. He never did anything spontaneous. And he was not a stupid man. He wouldn't just go for a boat ride in the middle of dinner, in the middle of night. And they claimed he drowned, but somehow his body turned up a week later in the spot he supposedly drowned. They couldn't find it after he went missing. And it's very clear he was murdered. So they'll kill even their own. And they have no value of human life. I don't know what, I've never, I'm not near a circle of power myself, so I don't interact with these kind of people, but it's beyond my level. Most people I interact with, try and be decent people. I'm not in the company of murderers and people who have just no regard for human life.
I just hope any CIA agents that track either of us or our show listen to that. Because, today you got a paycheck and tomorrow you may have a bullet in the head or water in your lungs, or you may be tossed out a window. So,
it's a question, what's it for? I mean, Vietnam was just a debacle for U.S. foreign policy. And I mean, the United States has, so much going for it as far as resources, as far as a skilled workforce, as far as universities. They don't have to colonize countries all along the world to have a prosperous economy. So,
one of the things I was really struck by, was it the Brian Wilson article, or was it another one that I read by another writer where they were talking about how they were brainwashed in the military to see the Vietnamese as non-human, and I think that's something that's always worth discussing, how this military training and also just our propaganda in general dehumanizes people. Like somehow the Vietnamese are not human beings. They're less than. and how the Palestinians aren't human beings, they're less than, and how that concept is necessary to drum into the minds of Israeli soldiers or American soldiers so that they can commit these atrocities. So I was very touched by that. And then also, if you
Yeah,
wanted to
that was
talk,
an article by Scott Camille,
that was it.
and
Okay.
he was part of the Winter Soldier investigation and hearings. He served in Vietnam, and he grew up. Yeah, you can see how these young men grew up in that era. They were kind of instilled with the notion that communism was this unmitigated evil that America had to fight. And that mixed with the racist attitude toward Asians uh, to create this toxic brew. And the soldiers went over there. They just committed horrific atrocities. Yeah, when you dehumanize people, that they're communists, that they're gooks,
Racist.
they're slopes, they're gooks. Or yeah, the Israelis today consider the Palestinian as all terrorists. You just mow them down, and you feel good about it. You feel like you're actually doing a service for humanity, and that's the trick of propaganda. And yeah, Camille spoke about how and at the Winter Soldier, this was a group of soldiers who were able to come out of that conditioning and that brainwashing after they had been in Vietnam for a while. Often, actually, they had to come back and decompress. And initially, even Camille said he hated anti-war people whenever he would see them, and I think he was conditioned to hate anti-war activists and see them as anti-American and against soldiers. But something led him to change his view. Maybe it was books he read, or I don't know, just time to think about it. And he ended up changing and joining the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And they had these hearing, Winter Soldier, where they admitted that they had committed horrific crimes, and they tried to broadcast how the whole system was sick, how they'd been conditioned to kill and commit these atrocities in Vietnam and to hate the communists and dehumanize, like what you're saying. And they testified about this, and it awakened people to the sickness of the Cold War culture and the military. They talked, I remember, because I watched that film, and I used to show it to students when I taught courses on the Vietnam War, and it touched the students. He talked about how in the Marine Corps, they would harden them, and then they would give them a rabbit. The boot camp was really a tough experience, really, really harsh. And there was no humanity, so they gave them a rabbit, to keep their sense of humanity, and they could be affectionate to the rabbit. But then on the last day before boot camp, they testified that the drill sergeant would come and snap the neck of the rabbit, and that was the lesson they got to Vietnam: and no humanity, it was just to harden them. And so that was moving to watch. That they testified publicly, and a lot of people saw.
Wait, you showed this to your students? No wonder they didn't ask you to come back.
Well, it
that
was
that that
eye-opening
really
for the
took on
students. I see
no,
my
that took
students
on the power structure.
all over the place, and they thank me that it opened their mind to stuff. And the students are very open-minded, and that's real education. But yeah, we've had other shows about what's going on in our education system, and that is very sad.
Showing that film is amazing.
Yeah, it's a touching film, and respect these guys that they were able to come out of that conditioning and try and work toward peace for the rest of their lives. And Scott Camille is still active in peace groups in Florida as just a stand-up guy. And he's kind of like Brian Wilson. Yeah, had a similar experience where Wilson grew up in a very right-wing family. His father was in the John Birch Society and even Ku Klux Klan. Although he was apolitical as a youth, he was into athletics, and he was a good student. He had various degrees, but then he was drafted into the Army, went to Vietnam, and he was still kind of apolitical, but that just changed him. He saw horrible things in Vietnam. He was part of a group that his job was to go into villages that had been bombed and provide a bomb damage assessment for the military. And one day he said he went into a village and there were 150 people who had been killed 30 minutes before. And like he was with this Arvin soldier who was just laughing. He's like, and like Wilson was kind of sad, and he saw a woman killed with her kids, and he's like, "Why are you laughing?" He's like, "Oh, they're communists. They deserve to be killed." And Wilson just started, scratching his head, and he's like, "Well, they're women and children." And he had some kind of epiphany. He said that one of the women was his sister, and he still talks to her. And also, he had this epiphany that this is how the West was won. We slaughtered all the natives like this, and that he said we didn't belong. He felt like he had some kind of something took over his body and said, you don't belong in Vietnam. And that stuck with him, and he became a lifelong peace activist. And he was trying to block arms shipment. He was involved in civil disobedience acts, and he was involved with Camille's group, I believe, Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And then in the 80s, he learned about what the U.S. and CIA were doing in Nicaragua, the Contra War, and he was involved with delegations to Nicaragua. And then he tried to block a train of arms shipments, and the train sped up and ran him over and almost killed him, and he lost his legs and got some brain damage. And then he became a national hero in Nicaragua because of that. And even Ronald Reagan's daughter wrote him a note saying she thought her father was crazy to call the Contras freedom fighters, and just expressing her solidarity with him. That's Ronald Reagan's daughter. So, but he's a remarkable man. Yeah, he's just very intelligent. He spoke at a webinar recently that I attended, and he's just a very insightful guy. And he said, I was well educated. I had a master's degree before he went to Vietnam, but I knew nothing. I didn't know anything about Vietnam before I went there, and I didn't know even a lot about my own country. I had this kind of mythic understanding of my own country. And he's like, now I just want to learn from other people, learn about other countries. And I think that's a good approach. That's a good role model for young people, that we should just try and listen. We have a lot of diversity, even in the United States. So, when you engage with people of different nationalities, just try and talk to them to learn more about their country. And unfortunately, our education system is failing our youth. I think it's good in certain technical skills and, certain professional standards in certain fields. You can still get very good education, but in the humanities and liberal arts, and instilling a broader consciousness, political consciousness, historical consciousness, our education system is failing badly, unfortunately.
I'd just like to take us back a little bit to Scott Camille and a couple of quotes that he wrote, just to give our audience kind of the feeling that the soldiers, and in his case, I believe he was a Marine, experienced. And these are his words: "We measured success by body count. We were taught that we would win if we killed 10 Vietnamese for every American killed. We wanted to win, so we killed as many as possible. We operated in free fire zones where we were allowed to kill everyone we encountered. Our method of operation was called search and destroy." I think that's, pretty much sums it up. And then there's another quote that I'm looking for. Maybe Jeremy has it, but he talks about how this concept of communist was used as propaganda. And really, he realized that he and the United States were an invading power, taking away the land, the property, and the lives of a sovereign nation. And he saw through that eventually. And, we see that today. We see that all over the place. How there's this, thing, oh, it's democracy, oh, it's freedom. That's why we're doing this. We're doing this because, to promote, good things in these countries. But the reality is very different. And these are the words from the people who were there, who their job was to destroy, to search and destroy. Thank you.
Yeah, and related to the Burns film, he could have interviewed people like Scott Camille. And instead, that film presents a very negative view of the anti-war movement, which really was a very honorable movement, and it presents the trope that anti-war activists were anti-soldier and were spitting on the soldiers. In fact, there's a book by Jerry Lemke, who's a friend of mine, who's a Vietnam veteran sociologist, found that to be a complete urban legend. There's almost no cases ever documented of anti-war activists spitting on soldiers. And people like Camille show that Camille became part of the anti-war movement. VVAW was an important part of the anti-war movement, and the Winter Soldier hearing was an important part of the anti-war movement in getting the message out about that evil conditioning you described. So, and yeah, his comments are very powerful, about the genocidal nature of that war, because they were the mere gook rule. I read a lot of books and novels about Vietnam. Some are written by Vietnam veterans, and they spoke about the mere gook rule. How do you, because McNamara developed the body count. That was the way to measure success. And then they said, how do you measure success? How do you know he's a Viet Cong? They say, well, he's dead. That's the mere gook rule. And these guys still talk that way. Even at this conference, I met veteran, and they still use those terms. It just goes to show that the nature of this war. And as you say, these wars continue in the Middle East, and they use slurs to describe Iraqis or Afghans, and now the Israelis in Gaza, and it's just racial barbarism, really, and it's a chapter in the ongoing history of Western colonialism, and it's a totally inglorious, long chapter in world history. And we're trying to build, we can learn from those veterans and build an opposition movement against that, because it's an atavistic form of humanity, really.
Yeah, it's true. And Brian Wilson is really working right now because the United States government considers Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba as dangers to the United States, which is, what we've discussed in other shows. They're a danger of a good example, especially Nicaragua, who is extremely humanitarian to its people with healthcare and education and all kinds of different programs and social programs and development programs and housing and roads, electricity, clean drinking water. I mean, but Nicaragua is still under attack, and Brian Wilson's work isn't over, and he's still defending a sovereign nation that is based on humanitarian and egalitarian principles.
Well, yeah, the American way of thinking, I don't think, has changed that much from the Cold War. And, anything left of center is branded as communist and bad. And really, it's just because it's bad for U.S. corporations. Again, to my point about the government is really representative of the dominant class interest in that society. And these corporations make huge amount of money, in third world countries, and they want to keep the wages low. And they don't want those countries, claiming control over their own natural resources. So they label as communist any left-leaning or nationalistic government, and they demonize and denounce it, and they whip people up into hatred. And that's what results in support for these regime change operations or wars. And yeah, there's a pretty consistent thread from Vietnam, because Vietnam followed the Maoist model. I mean, Maoist China extracted, basically paved the way for China's Renaissance, and established, applied Marxist ideals toward an overwhelmingly peasant population. So developed a lot of social programs to uplift the poor. And the literacy rate, when the Maoists took over China, they invested in rural education, rural health care, and the literacy rates went way up. And then the healthcare standard, they promoted women's rights. So there were so many progressive aspects of that revolution in China, and the Vietnamese and Korean revolution followed the Maoist playbook, and they're trying to extract themselves from any kind of imperial or neo-colonial arrangement, establish their economic sovereignty, and that's why they've been demonized so thoroughly for generations. And the U.S. is still trying to undermine the People's Republic of China, which was set up in 1949. And there are all kinds of ways they're trying to do that, and there's, including psychological warfare, to claim that the Chinese committed genocide against the Uyghur, and the reports coming out of Xinjiang show otherwise, that there may have been some excess of Chinese policy, but the term genocide is not a legitimate one. And also there was an Islamic terrorist group operating out of Xinjiang, so some of the heavy-handed government response was responsive to that, but that's never discussed in this cottage industry of the Uyghur genocide. So history, and that's similar, to bring it back to what we're discussing at the beginning of the show. The CIA was running those propaganda operations to depict the North Vietnamese government as horrific. I discussed in my article, Tom Dooley was like a celebrity in the 1950s. He was a priest who wrote these articles in Reader Digest about how the Viet Minh were supposedly disemboweling women, and this dark specter had taken over North Vietnam. And it turned out he was working for the CIA, and it was all misinformation, atrocity fabrication, just to whip up public opinion against the communists. And that's something, the Burns film whitewashes, and he repeats a lot of that red peril propaganda. He demonizes the anti-war movement and whitewashes the CIA. So unfortunately, things don't change that much.
On a personal note, I've been in that region a few times, and I've had the privilege of seeing the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh, and I really recommend for any American to travel to Vietnam and to view firsthand the War Remnants Museum, because you really see the destruction of a country, a beautiful, beautiful country with agriculture and fishing and beautiful villages and a very peaceful Buddhist way of life being utterly destroyed with napalm and Agent Orange and the blowback of Agent Orange on our military, and all of the torture. And Jeremy, do you want to talk a little bit about the Phoenix program? It was particularly horrific, and then there was the offshoot in Cambodia, which was the Khmer Rouge, which was again a CIA thing. And I one of the most depressing places I had gone to was Cambodia. And you could still feel this whole missing generation of people that were murdered by the Khmer Rouge at that time. And, the country really hasn't recovered. People haven't recovered. They lost, a whole generation of people. And, and then we see this in Ukraine. Okay. I mean, so many young men have been killed in Ukraine because of the United States forwarding and forcing this war. So, it's the remnants of this, and the War Remnants Museum, and the remnants of this, last generations and generations of suffering and psychological and physical pain, and also in Vietnam and certainly in Cambodia and Laos. I've also traveled to Laos and Myanmar. Fortunately, that country wasn't invaded, but there's all this unexploded ordnance throughout that whole region. And children to this day are still, and farmers are injured terribly, if not killed, by these unexploded ordnance. And this is all over Ukraine. This is all over the place. This is these butterfly bombs and things like that are just extremely tragic and horrid.
Yeah, well, and that the Burns, could have showed the legacy of the war by, he had all the budget and all the resources at his disposal. Why didn't he go into some villages? People are still being killed and kids are being maimed because they pick up thing they think is a toy, but it's an undetonated ordnance. And there was an incident in Laos in February. One young girl was killed and another was badly maimed. So he could have showed just how horrific this war was. And as far as the Phoenix program, yeah, he quotes an American Phoenix operative who said, "Oh yeah, there were these South Vietnamese cowboys, and they did some bad things." And it's kind of evading the responsibility of the United States for coordinating that operation. And I go into it, and I published a book with the University of Massachusetts in 2012 on American police training programs. And the chapter in Vietnam shows how Phoenix originated with a program run out of Michigan State University, which shows how complicit American universities are with American imperialism. That they were contracted to train the police of Ngo Dinh Diem, and they trained them in a political way to carry out the war on the Viet Minh supporters, and they helped to improve the records collection. A lot of what they were doing was just kind of technical work to improve their records collection and port technologies, and that assisted in the development of blacklists, so they would identify leaders or subversives who were associated with the Viet Minh, and then they would be arrested and often tortured. And as it escalated under Phoenix, eventually the CIA more directly took it over, and as one of the USAID Office of Public Safety in part, they started just kidnapping and assassinating people. And people on the blacklist included like civilian officials, because the Viet Cong would set up shadow government. They didn't view the Diem government as legitimate. They set up a shadow government, and in some cases they took over that parts of the country. They actually succeeded in taking it over militarily, so they set up their own administration. So town mayors would be targeted under Phoenix, and that's what's happened in Ukraine as well. The parallel Phoenix being run by the CIA with the SBU, and they're targeting town mayors. And this has been reported even in mainstream newspapers that mayors have been assassinated, civilian officials. So they got on the blacklist. And actually, there was a congressional critic at the time, Ogden Reed, who said that if this was in the Civil War, Jefferson Davis would have been a target under Phoenix. So and the mayor of Macon, Georgia. So they were targeting civilian leaders and officials, and it was just a torture and murder program. They were identified through the blacklist, kidnapped, sent to and what the Con Son was a prison where they were sent. And it was a torture chamber. They were being placed in these cages beneath the ground. And this was run out of USAID's Office of Public Safety. And the police
Public safety.
Yeah, the warden was a guy named Frank Walton of Con Son Prison. That's where a lot of the political prisoners rounded up under Phoenix were sent. And then he told the media, "Oh, it's like a Boy Scout recreational camp." But then there was a congressional delegation, and one of the staffers, Tom Harkin, was tipped off, and Don Luce, who was a volunteer in Vietnam, they were tipped off that there were these hidden annex of the jail where the political prisoners were being kept in underground cages, and they were chained to the floor, sometimes for years, so they became paralyzed. And the guards would throw things into the cage, even feces or lime, and they would just throw them a piece of bread a day, or to keep them alive, but they're barely alive. And this was compared to concentration camps. And I did a study in the USAID record of the police and prison programs in South Vietnam. And because they were arresting so many people, the jails were vastly overcrowded, and they had nowhere to keep people. So they were saying, and these were reports I read in the National Archive in Washington, police advisors working for USAID would do a tour of the different prisons and write a report on prison conditions. And they were often appalled. They would say, there's not enough space. They're sleeping on top of each other. There's not enough food, or they have to cook food starting at 4 a.m. to try and feed everybody, and that the facility is overrun by rats. And then they would say, well, the USAID budgeted some money for an expansion of the prison, but the corrupt ARVN officers stole the money budgeted. And that was an incredibly corrupt army, because it was a puppet army of the United States. It was financed from the beginning by the United States, and there was no nation to speak of. A lot of Vietnamese, they see their nation as one nation. They don't see any legitimacy to the South Vietnamese nation the U.S. was trying to set up. And in fact, there were supposed to be elections in 1956 to unify Vietnam, But Eisenhower admitted in his memoir that Ho Chi Minh would win 80% of the vote. So they didn't go forward with the election. Most viewed that as illegitimate. And that's why the Vietnam War was such a disaster, politically and militarily, for the United States. And yeah, it's a history that should be taught, but it's not being taught properly in schools. And even as I was saying, in liberal academia, there's this whole wave of scholarship to rehabilitate Diem and to show he was some kind of authentic South Vietnamese patriot, and to limit, to kind of minimize the American role. And they cloak in this language. They say, oh, the Vietnamese had their own agency. But yet the United States was the one who invaded and bombed and napalmed and dumped the Agent Orange, and who financed that renegade government. So this is an episode of imperialism. As much as there were some Vietnamese who supported Diem, it was a minority in the country. They had, and there were some grievances some had against the communists. There were class divisions. A lot of the upper class were the ones who were threatened by land reform and the Maoist program. So they allied with Diem and the Americans, and they were viewed as, so yes, they had some agency, but if the Americans weren't there, the country would have been unified. But they're not teaching that to students, and even in the universities.
Well, the danger, as you've pointed out multiple times, is if you learn history and you understand history, then you can extrapolate and use that knowledge to evaluate new wars and new occupations and invasions. And really the whole terminology of war is crap. I mean, we're not talking about a war that's balanced between two countries. We're talking about invasion, occupation, conquest. So that wraps
Absolutely.
up our show for today.
And they
Jeremy,
continue to demonize the communists and present them. There was the American Historical Review, because I follow this stuff, 50th anniversary, and this professor at William College was like, "Oh yeah, I understand. Everybody viewed the communists as loathsome." Well, how loathsome? They were the ones who liberated their country, first against the French and then against the United States. And I read an article in the New York Times on the 50th anniversary that had just quoted regular Vietnamese and said, "Look how far we've come. We're so proud. We're an independent nation now, and our country has developed. We have a lot of amenities now we never had." So how loathsome are these people? They liberated their country and they built Vietnam into what it is today, which is much better than it was in 1970. So they're not loathsome.
well, Jeremy, we got to wrap it up. Please tell our audience how they can follow your important work and financially support your efforts. And also, we finally got a LOL on Substack. So I hope everyone will be checking us out and perhaps sending us some donations on Substack. Jeremy,
Yes,
please go
please
ahead.
support us on Substack, and I have a Substack, Too Hot for the Mainstream, and also I write for Covert Action magazine, and we had a series of articles to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War, and yeah, included discussing some of these issues Gloria was raising, like that of undetonated ordnance, the long-term effects of Agent Orange, as well as just examining how the history of the war is being misrepresented today.
Well, that wraps up our show for today. This is Left on Left. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov. Remember to like, donate, and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. We're going to wrap it up pretty quick today because we've got to do a follow-on recording
Okay.
for those people watching at home. Guys, I sent you guys the link in email. Also, it's in the private chat here. But for everybody watching at home, thank you for watching. Well, we got to run, and we'll see you next week with a previously recorded episode. So stay tuned. We might be taking off a couple weeks, but the show will still be going. So we'll see you next time.